Thanks for your patience, everyone. So as Danielle gave a brief intro, I'm going to talk a little bit today about a framework that we've been calling product-led protocol development, but really the point of this as a concept is, so I've been in the Web3 space now for 5 or 6 years and have seen a lot of different projects that have built themselves and teams that have built these projects in many different ways. And it's been really interesting to observe how, as the industry has evolved, how protocols think and teams think about building protocols that do get really significant adoption. And so that's something that have spent a lot of time thinking about, especially given my product background at Protocol Labs and working on some really interesting and really complex protocols. So along the same lines of some of the themes today that we've heard about from Henry and others about UX and product and really making that a focus when we think about building in Web3. So starting at the very beginning, so one of the things that I have realized for myself what it means to build in Web3 is much more a set of ideologies and principles and values that we bring to the solutions we design, as opposed to any particular solution. So, building a company in this space doesn't necessarily mean that we're building smart contracts or that we're building layer 1 blockchains. But I think a lot of us in this room, when we're building in this space, we are keeping some of these goals in mind, right? So when we think about architecture, it's really building systems that are modular and composable. Whether that's something that we can compose with other solutions that we build as teams or other experiments that people are running in the space. I think it's really about, on the user side, making sure that we're prioritizing giving users ownership over all of the data and interactions they have with the platforms with the solutions that they're engaging with, and really thinking about how we can maintain user privacy as well. And then from a network and participation standpoint, I think this is, we all want to build systems that are decentralized and open source as much as possible, really permissionless so that as many people can participate in them as possible, and then ultimately working towards a place where we can have our communities actually own and govern the direction of the projects that we're building. So I think when we think about all these principles together, a lot of what we gravitate towards when we think about building solutions are smart contracts or immutable protocols. But one of the things that, even before we think about those specific solutions, it's just like, why even do this? Why is this a worthwhile way of thinking about building technology? Because it's a lot of things to keep in mind that make it much more difficult, much more in a lot of ways, than building just proprietary solutions in kind of the typical Web2 startup oriented way, right? So I think the reason it's worth it is, I think, for two main reasons. One is more philosophical, and then another is a little bit more practical. But the first is just really believing that this is a better way to build technology. It may not be like the best way, the world is always changing, progress is constantly happening, and so there will be better ways in the future. But one of the master's degrees that I dropped out of was a bioengineering degree, which was with a focus in brain-computer interfaces. And that's actually one of the reasons I got interested in Web3 as an industry, because when I thought about what the future might look like when we have BCI, if we build BCI the way that we build any other solution today, that's going to look like all of our neural data living on Google Cloud and being monetized, and us being heavily targeted for ads. And that just seemed like, when you really project to the future, that's not the sort of world that we want to live in. So I think a lot of the principles that we're building into the way we build technology today is really important and is going to protect us when we look much further down the road. So I think that's really important. And then another reason is, I think a lot of us here believe that this can be a really compelling alternative to thinking about value capture that can really rival some of the best business models of the last several decades. So it's a more practical reason. So I think, over the last several years, as the space has evolved, I think, some people will describe the approach that a lot of teams have taken as build it and they will come in a slightly pejorative way, and I don't really mean it in that way, but the pattern that a lot of teams have taken is, starting by identifying a need for something, a problem that they think needs to be solved in the world, designing a really beautiful protocol, often really well-designed protocols, to solve that problem. And then often, launching a token alongside that protocol, maybe selling it directly or listing it on an exchange, and then, maybe the core development team has some allocation of the token, which they'll sell to continue funding the team's operating expenses, and then leveraging the financial capital that comes from the token to incentivize an early ecosystem of builders. And this is an approach that, can work, and I think has worked in a lot of cases. I think especially when we were looking at the earlier days of this industry, where that was really, it was kind of this like entry point into the world for actually building protocols as businesses, and this like new mechanism of tokens being a really powerful way to crowdfund and fundraise for early projects. And so that was something that I think we saw a lot of success with in 2015, 2016, 2017 even. But I think more recently, in order for this type of approach to work, I think it requires companies to start with either really significant financial resources or a really strong brand that they can rally an ecosystem around from basically day one. And most early stage projects don't have this, when they're starting. And even if projects do, this approach can be really time consuming. It can take, maybe 5 to 10 years for this to really get off the ground, which is like a time frame on which most projects are looking to see really significant adoption much sooner than that. And so I think we've also seen in this time frame many projects that have ended up taking this approach and ending up in the build it and they will come graveyard. And so we want to avoid that going forward. So I think one of the ways that we can mitigate this risk is really thinking about whatever we're building with a product mindset. And I think something that's really important to think about here is that the reason for existence for each of our projects is something that I think we should always be holding steady. There's some spark that ignited whatever the problem is that we were trying to solve, and that's the North Star that should ideally never change, because that problem is probably valid and worth solving. But the approach that we take to getting there can iterate and evolve as we're learning and as we go over time. And so I think having the North Star be steady, but always thinking about product market fit. And in this case, there's sort of two types of product market fit that I'm going to talk a little bit about. It's like product market fit or PMF, so product market fit and also protocol market fit. So we've been calling this at Tephra Labs, because this is an approach that we're taking with what we're building. We call it product-led protocol development, and there are 3 phases to this. The first is starting with the protocol, and then starting with the product. That's very important. The product comes first, protocol, and then building an ecosystem. So the first phase, which is building a product, is really the very sort of almost traditional way of thinking about building successful products, that there is tons of resources and literature and lore about what it takes to build a product that achieves product market fit. And I've included a little quote here from Mark Andreessen's really great blog post on this topic, which I honestly think everyone should read, including in Web3. It's called The Only Thing That Matters. But I think the key here is that what it takes to build a really successful product is learning as much as possible about your users and really understanding their needs and not being afraid to iterate quickly and pivot as needed. And making sure that also what you are building is building in a market that is growing ideally. So the product phase, there's a lot of literature about what it takes to get there, but that's really like the first piece of this, is building something that works. And then the second phase is the protocol phase, and this is really about how do you think about building and bootstrapping a protocol. One of the things that when designing a really great protocol, and I'm not going to talk about that, there's so many people are much better and have so many more relevant ideas about how to do that than I do. But one of the things that I think is really important about this phase is utilizing the learnings from the product phase and designing those learnings into whatever the solution is for your protocol. And as you are building this really incredible, well-designed protocol, making sure to then loop back and integrate that protocol into your product as well. And if you do this, there are a couple of really great benefits that happen. So one of the things is you have a user base, and ideally, if you did a great job building a product that was successful, you should have a pretty significant user base for your protocol on day one, which can be really hard today if you just launch a protocol into the market and have to go out and find developers who are going to build applications on top of your protocol, and then them bootstrapping their user bases and so on. So this is an easy way to kind of have usage for your protocol basically on day one. And then kind of along the lines, a lot of speakers today have talked about the immutability of smart contracts, and the fact is that protocols are hard to change. Inevitably, you will learn something new and you will need to change and upgrade your protocol, but if you have designed product learnings into the protocol that you build, you will probably have to make fewer changes less quickly than if you started with a protocol first. And so that's also a really nice change, or a really nice benefit about having a protocol come second. And then the other really important one is that you will start out with a very inspiring example of how other developers can use your protocol in their applications as well. We see a lot, I think, in the Web3 space, protocols that will incentivize people in their ecosystem to build these like small sample applications on top of the protocol layer. And those can be interesting, but often are really small toys and don't really demonstrate what's like so powerful about the protocol. And so really showing that a successful business was built on this protocol can be an extremely powerful way to bootstrap the developer excitement about your protocol as well. And then one thing to just caveat here is that I think some folks maybe would be worried about risking overfitting your protocol to your product use case. And I think this is a valid risk and something that can be mitigated by just being really thoughtful and ruthless and about how you're designing the protocol, making sure you're thinking about numerous different use cases and attacking it from many different angles, et cetera. But I will also just say that I think ending up with a protocol that is overfit, but to a real use case and a real need is much better than ending up with a protocol that no one uses. So it's phase 2. And then phase 3 is now starting to really invest in building an ecosystem around your protocol. And I think there are many different, really, this in the last several years, I think we've seen a lot of really creative strategies for how to build an ecosystem. There are some sort of high-level ideas here. When I was at Protocol Labs, we talked a lot about this idea of a builder funnel, so sort of thinking about the developer journey, starting with maybe leveraging your project in a hackathon project, and then some of those graduate to accelerator teams, and then some of those will maybe earn some early investment and then become fully venture-backed companies. You can also think about incentives. Maybe if at this point you've launched a token, also thinking about grants and partnerships and airdrops and things like that. And also just really great developer relations generally, and also involving your community more through governance. But this is all something that we think should come sort of much later in the process. And we'll just have so much more energy around it because you have like a lot of great activity and traction already. So one other thing just to kind of call out is the way that I sort of laid out those steps is pretty sequential. It's like starts with building a product and then goes to building a protocol afterwards, which you can maybe think of as a little bit more product first approach. But I think there are definitely cases when it makes sense to build both products and protocols in parallel. And I think this is really if like the protocol is really the key thing that differentiates what you're doing. So if it's like a decentralized alternative to something that exists in the world already, that's kind of really important that you sort of have a protocol from day one. But you maybe would still want to have some sort of front end or a really powerful application that's leveraging the protocol as well. So it's not just the protocol and then like people have to figure out how to use it. So I think that's one situation in which it makes sense to do both in parallel. And if you already have a really strong sense of what you want this protocol to do. If you're sort of still learning and you kind of know generally what the space is that you're trying to solve problems in, but don't really have the nugget of insight of what's going to be like the best modular, tiny, scalable, solution for that, then maybe start with the product first. I wanted to include a few examples here because I think this approach is still pretty new, honestly. Most of the examples that we've seen of projects taking this sort of approach in the Web3 space have been either very simple or not really doing this at all. And we'll see kind of how that goes. But I think there are a couple really interesting examples of teams that have done sort of this like product and protocol development in parallel. Farcaster, I think, is a great example of this, and they've written as well a little bit about their kind of approach. Sound is another one, and Mirror as well. And it's interesting in these cases too, because I think, especially for Farcaster and Mirror, in both of those cases, those are examples where the protocol was really important to differentiate the product, and so it made a lot of sense that they kind of built them at the same time. And then this is sort of an interesting example because, so when I worked on IPFS and Filecoin, this was, obviously Protocol Labs is an incredible company, has been around for a really long time and has built really amazing technology, and has seen really great adoption over the last few years. But I think when we as a team decided that we wanted to build some of these really compelling on-ramps that were really great products to interact with IPFS and Filecoin, we really saw the adoption and usage of both of these projects skyrocket. It was, like sort of a little bit more the hockey stick sort of acceleration that we want to see with everything we build. So it's not really the sequence we're talking about, but just a similar effect for a protocol that was more mature and that has existed for a long time. So yeah, just to sum it up, I mean, I think there's a lot that we need to do in this period, this down cycle. But I think taking a really measured approach to how we're thinking about building protocols that can scale and that will last and really survive the test of time and can be generation defining. I think there is like a way for us to bring some control back into how we're building those types of projects, as opposed to just sort of hoping and praying that it will work out, which not everyone wants to do, but we often are in that situation. And so I think this is an approach that we are definitely taking at Tephra Labs. I think I've seen a lot of projects benefit from it, and think it can really be helpful for protocols that want to see big scale. Thanks.